I still remember the morning of my final exam as if it were preserved in amber, untouched by time but heavy with regret. The campus was unusually quiet, wrapped in a pale winter fog that softened the outlines of buildings and made every footstep echo louder in my head. This exam wasn't just another test. It was the gatekeeper to my future, the score that would decide whether I could apply for the graduate programs I had dreamed about since my first year. I had studied for months, sacrificing sleep, friendships, and every small comfort because I believed effort always paid off. What I didn't understand then was how fragile plans become when other people are allowed to hold them. She was supposed to be my closest friend, the one person who knew how much this exam meant to me, and the last person I expected to become the reason everything collapsed. We met during our first semester, bonded by late-night library sessions and shared complaints about impossible professors. She had a way of making stress feel lighter, laughing at the worst moments and turning panic into something manageable. Over time, my trust in her grew naturally, without question. When she asked to borrow my notes the night before the exam, I didn't hesitate. When she suggested we revise together that morning, I agreed, believing teamwork would calm my nerves. I didn't know her mind was somewhere else entirely, fixed on someone who barely noticed her existence. Her crush was popular, confident, and careless with the attention he received. She orbited around him silently, reshaping her choices to stay within his reach, even if it meant crossing lines she once swore she never would. The sabotage wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no obvious betrayal that would have warned me in advance. It was subtle and cruel in its simplicity. She gave me the wrong exam room, insisted the schedule had changed, and watched as I trusted her without checking. By the time I realized something was wrong, precious minutes had drained away, leaving me breathless and panicked at the door of the correct hall. The invigilators were strict, unmoved by explanations or apologies. I was allowed in late, but my concentration was shattered. Questions blurred together, answers slipped through my fingers, and the confidence I had built over months evaporated in under an hour. I walked out knowing, deep down, that I had failed, not because I was unprepared, but because I had been misled. Only later did the truth surface, piece by piece, like shards of glass cutting deeper the more I tried to understand. She admitted everything with tears in her eyes, confessing that her crush had needed help during the same exam slot, and she panicked, choosing him over me in a moment of weakness. She said she never meant for it to go that far, that she thought I'd recover, that I was strong. Those words echoed painfully in my mind. Strength, I learned, is often assumed by those who take advantage of it. The results confirmed my worst fears. My score fell just short of the requirement for every program I had applied to, closing doors I had worked tirelessly to open. That single morning rewrote my future, forcing me to confront disappointment, betrayal, and a version of adulthood I hadn't planned for, all at once. In the weeks that followed, silence replaced our conversations, and the campus that once felt familiar turned hostile and cold. I avoided places we used to sit together, afraid memories would unravel what little resolve I had left. She tried to apologize repeatedly, messages growing longer and more desperate, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Every apology felt hollow compared to the consequences I was facing. My family asked questions I didn't know how to answer, and I learned to smile while carrying disappointment like a private wound. Yet somewhere beneath the anger and grief, something unexpected began to form. I started planning again, quietly, stubbornly, refusing to let that moment define the rest of my life. I didn't know it then, but this fracture was the beginning of a different path, one that would eventually take me further than the future I had lost. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it gave it direction. Instead of looking back, I focused on rebuilding, piece by piece, with a patience I never knew I possessed. Each small decision became an act of defiance against regret, and slowly, purpose replaced bitterness. The story, I thought, was ending here, but in reality, it was only learning how to begin. I carried that lesson forward, unaware that time would test it again, and that my silence would eventually speak louder than any accusation ever could for years ahead. 2 months after the results were released, the campus no longer felt like a battlefield but like an empty stage after the curtains had fallen. Everyone else was moving forward, celebrating offers, comparing admission letters, and speaking about the future as if it were guaranteed. I listened politely, nodding at conversations that no longer included me, and learned how isolation can exist even in crowded places. During that time, she disappeared completely, as if guilt had finally taught her restraint. I didn't ask about her, and no one volunteered information, which suited me just fine. Instead, I focused on damage control, researching alternative paths, retake options, and obscure programs that didn't rely so heavily on a single score. It felt humiliating at first, like admitting failure, but survival often demands humility before pride can return. I took a temporary job off campus, shelving books in a dusty archive that smelled of old paper and patience. The work was monotonous, but it gave my mind space to heal. Each evening, I read articles, revised concepts, and slowly rebuilt the confidence that exam had shattered. What surprised me most was how quickly routine became therapy. With every day that passed, the memory of that morning lost its sharpest edges, turning from an open wound into a scar I could touch without flinching. Somewhere in that quiet process, anger transformed into clarity. I stopped asking why it happened and started asking what I could still become. That shift didn't feel dramatic, but it changed everything. 6 months later, an unexpected email arrived from a mid-ranked university abroad, offering a conditional path into their graduate program. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't the future I had once imagined, but it was a door, and I had learned not to ignore those. I accepted without hesitation, pouring everything I had into meeting their requirements. The months that followed were relentless, filled with standardized tests, paperwork, and long nights that tested my endurance. Yet, for the first time since the betrayal, I felt aligned with my own effort again. Progress returned, slow but undeniable, reminding me that one person's choice didn't get to define my entire narrative. Exactly 2 years after the exam, my life looked nothing like it had back then. I was packing my belongings, preparing to leave for graduate school, when her message appeared on my phone. The sight of her name startled me more than I expected, not because of lingering feelings, but because of how distant they now seemed. She wrote about regret, about waiting, about realizing too late what she had lost. She said she had hoped time would soften my anger and that maybe, just maybe, I would still be there. Reading her words felt surreal, like receiving a letter meant for someone I no longer was. I didn't reply immediately. I sat with the message, noticing how calm I felt. There was no rush of emotion, no desire for revenge, only a quiet understanding of how far I had traveled internally. Her waiting, I realized, was never about me. It was about easing her conscience, about rewriting the past into something more forgiving. But my life had already moved forward, shaped by resilience rather than apology. When I finally responded, my message was brief and honest. I told her I hoped she had learned from her choices and that I wished her well. Then I turned off my phone and returned to packing, focused on the future waiting beyond that flight. As the plane took off weeks later, I looked down at the shrinking city and felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Betrayal had delayed me, redirected me, but it hadn't destroyed me. If anything, it had taught me patience, self-reliance, and the quiet power of moving on without spectacle. Somewhere behind me, she was still anchored to a moment that defined her regret. Ahead of me was uncertainty, ambition, and a version of myself forged by resilience rather than trust. I didn't feel victorious, and I didn't feel bitter. I felt free, and that freedom was worth every painful lesson that led me there at last. Freedom, I learned, is not loud or dramatic. It arrives quietly when you stop needing validation from the people who hurt you. As clouds swallowed the horizon, I understood that delays do not equal defeat, and detours can become destinations if you keep walking with intent. The future did not ask for explanations, only commitment. I closed my eyes, breathed deeply, and accepted that growth rarely feels fair while it is happening, but always feels earned when you finally stand on the other side, stronger, quieter, and certain of your own worth. That certainty stayed with me long after the seatbelt sign turned off and the journey truly began. Graduate school didn't begin with triumph the way movies promise. There was no dramatic sense of arrival, no swelling music when I stepped onto the new campus. Instead, there was exhaustion, jet lag, and the quiet anxiety of starting over in a place where no one knew my past. I was just another student with a suitcase and borrowed confidence, navigating unfamiliar buildings and accents. Yet beneath that uncertainty was something solid I hadn't carried before. I had already lost once, and survived it. That knowledge settled into me like armor, invisible but dependable, shaping how I approached everything that followed. Classes were harder than anything I'd faced before. Professors expected independence, precision, and resilience, and they offered little reassurance along the way. Many of my peers seemed effortlessly brilliant, fluent in ideas I was still struggling to grasp. Old insecurities resurfaced, whispering that maybe I didn't belong here after all, that this path was a consolation prize rather than a victory. But each time those thoughts appeared, I remembered the exam room door closing behind me years ago, the helplessness of standing on the wrong side of it. Compared to that moment, confusion was manageable. Doubt was familiar. I learned to sit with discomfort without letting it decide my worth. Slowly, I found my rhythm. Long nights in the lab replaced lonely evenings, and shared struggle built quiet camaraderie with classmates who became allies rather than competitors. We bonded over failed experiments, looming deadlines, and cheap coffee that tasted like perseverance. I stopped measuring myself against others and focused on consistency instead. One completed task at a time, one concept understood, one small success stacked onto another. Progress wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and for the first time, it felt entirely my own. Occasionally, fragments of my old life resurfaced. Mutual friends mentioned her in passing, always carefully, as if my reaction might still be volatile. They said she talked about me often, that she framed the story as a tragic misunderstanding, a mistake that cost her everything. I listened without comment, surprised by my own detachment. The version of me she remembered no longer existed, and the version she spoke of was frozen in a moment of guilt. I didn't correct the narrative or seek closure. I had learned that healing doesn't require agreement, only distance. One evening, while preparing a presentation that would determine my funding for the following year, I realized how far I'd come. The pressure was intense, but it didn't paralyze me. Instead, it sharpened my focus. I delivered the presentation calmly, answered questions with clarity, and walked out knowing I had done my best. When the approval email arrived days later, I didn't celebrate loudly. I sat quietly, letting relief wash over me, recognizing that this was the future I had fought for, not the one I had been promised. That night, her final message arrived. It was longer than the last, filled with reflections, apologies, and a request to meet someday, to talk everything through properly. She wrote about how seeing my progress from afar had forced her to confront her own stagnation, how waiting had turned into a habit she couldn't break. I read it once, then again, feeling empathy without obligation. Some people wait because they are afraid to move. Others move because waiting would destroy them. I finally understood the difference. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. My silence wasn't punishment, it was acceptance of reality as it stood. I had nothing left to explain. That chapter had already shaped me, and revisiting it would only blur the edges of who I had become. I archived the message, closed my laptop, and returned to my work, grounded in the present. Over time, her absence faded into irrelevance, replaced by challenges that demanded my full attention. Research deadlines, teaching responsibilities, and new ambitions filled the space where resentment once lived. I began mentoring younger students, recognizing pieces of my former self in their anxiety and hope. When they asked how I handled setbacks, I didn't tell them about betrayal or revenge. I told them about patience, adaptability, and the importance of not letting one moment define an entire life. Looking back, I no longer saw that ruined exam as the end of something precious. It was the disruption that forced me onto a path I might never have chosen otherwise. A path that taught me restraint instead of reaction, growth instead of bitterness. I hadn't won in the way people expect, but I had evolved, and that felt far more permanent. Some people wait for forgiveness to feel free. Others build lives so full that forgiveness becomes unnecessary. I belonged to the latter now, and that quiet certainty carried me forward, steady and unafraid, into whatever came next. By the time my final year of graduate school arrived, life had settled into a steady, demanding rhythm that left little room for nostalgia. Days blended into weeks of research milestones, teaching duties, and long-term planning that stretched far beyond the version of me who once measured success by a single exam. I had grown comfortable with uncertainty, learning that stability isn't the absence of chaos but the ability to move through it without losing direction. Friends began asking about my plans after graduation, and for the first time, I answered without hesitation. I spoke about possibilities, not guarantees, confident that adaptability had become my strongest skill. It was during this period that I fully understood the weight of what had changed. The anger that once defined my memory of her had dissolved into something neutral, almost distant. She was no longer a villain or a lesson waiting to be justified. She was simply a person who made a choice and lived with its consequences, just as I had. That realization didn't come from forgiveness but from growth. I had outpaced the need to assign meaning to her actions, focusing instead on the life unfolding in front of me. An invitation to present my research at an international conference marked a quiet turning point. Standing behind the podium, facing an audience of scholars whose work I once admired from afar, I felt a calm assurance settle in. This moment existed because I had persisted, because I had refused to let humiliation calcify into defeat. After the presentation, conversations flowed easily, connections formed naturally, and opportunities surfaced without being forced. For the first time, I saw how detours can enrich a journey rather than diminish it. That evening, while walking alone through unfamiliar streets, I reflected on the idea of waiting. She had waited for me, believing time would restore what guilt had broken. I, on the other hand, had waited only long enough to regain my footing before moving forward. Waiting, I realized, is not inherently noble or foolish. It becomes one or the other depending on whether it leads to growth or stagnation. My waiting had been purposeful, anchored in effort. Hers had been passive, anchored in regret. That difference explained everything. Months later, as graduation approached, messages of congratulations began arriving from unexpected places. Former classmates, distant relatives, even acquaintances who barely knew my story reached out, celebrating milestones they assumed had come easily. I accepted their praise graciously, aware of how misleading appearances can be. Success, I had learned, often disguises the cost paid to achieve it. Beneath the surface of my accomplishments lay years of recalibration, restraint, and resolve that few people ever saw. On graduation day, wearing robes that felt heavier than they looked, I spotted my family in the crowd. Their pride was quiet but unmistakable, communicated through smiles rather than words. As my name was called and I crossed the stage, there was no dramatic surge of emotion, only a deep, grounding sense of completion. This wasn't triumph over someone else, it was alignment with myself. I had reached a place shaped not by revenge or validation, but by consistency and choice. That evening, while packing to move once again, I found an old notebook from my undergraduate days. Inside were anxious plans, rigid timelines, and the naive certainty that life could be controlled if approached correctly. I smiled at those pages, not with ridicule, but compassion. That version of me had done his best with the tools he had then. The world had simply required more. I never heard from her again, and I didn't need to. Closure had arrived quietly, without confrontation or explanation. It came through momentum, through building something too substantial to be shaken by the past. I understood now that moving on isn't about forgetting, it's about outgrowing. The memories remained, but they no longer dictated my direction. As I stepped into the next chapter of my life, I carried one enduring truth with me. Betrayal can delay you, redirect you, even wound you deeply, but it cannot define you unless you allow it to. Growth is not loud, justice is not always visible, and peace rarely arrives on time. Yet if you keep choosing forward motion over fixation, life has a way of rewarding resilience in subtle, lasting ways. My story didn't end with revenge or reconciliation. It ended with progress, and that, I learned, is the most complete ending of all.